A presentation today that I usually give in schools, and it's going to have a little bit different to what I usually give in schools, obviously to tailor it to the audience. And what we're going to be looking at is 3 questions. Why someone would join the army, what army training might be like, and what war is like. So they're the 3 things we're going to kind of look into today. Now it's interesting that Les said that this event here has been accepted by the Ministry of Defence and put on the Armed Forces Day website. I don't know if you've been looking at the Veterans for Peace Facebook page lately, but we've actually got a gallery running this week in Shoreditch in London, Action Man Battlefield Casualties, where we're showing our latest advert, and also we've got the sets on display there. And that's been accepted as an Armed Forces Day event as well, so it's good news all round. So I'm going to start off by looking at why someone might join the army. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience and then have a look at what's happening now. So why did I join the army? You know, people often ask me, you're a peace activist, you're in Veterans for Peace, why did you ever bother joining the army? Well, believe it or not, when I was growing up, I didn't actually ever think I'd be a member of Veterans for Peace. I grew up in a military family. My granddad was in the Navy, my uncles were in the Navy, I had cousins in the Navy, cousins in the army. And we all grew up in this family looking up to my granddad, who was this World War II hero. He'd been in the Navy detachment that had hunted down the Bismarck. He had a load of medals stuffed in this drawer. And we spent a lot of our childhoods trying to encourage him to get these medals out of a drawer. They were stuffed in a drawer in an old paper envelope. And actually looking back on it, I think he only showed us them maybe 2 or 3 times. When I was growing up, I was captivated by Remembrance Sunday, the sort of sombre nature of this ceremony, the veterans with their medals, the uniforms. It seemed to be very important to my young mind, this solemn ceremony, and the way that the soldiers, the old soldiers, were respected. And this had a real impact on me as a kid. I went on to start watching Sunday afternoon war films, World War II films, and all of these films showed a very one-sided version of history. British as the good guys who won the war. Germans and Japanese as the bad guys. Germans as people who carried out the genocide against the Jews, and the Japanese who ran terrible concentration camps. And I grew up with an immense amount of pride in Britain, an immense amount of pride that we'd stood up to these sort of imperialistic countries that had carried out these great crimes against humanity. I also read, we didn't have computer games when I was a kid, we had Commando comic books, these little kind of tiny comic books, and I was fascinated by these. And also once family members and friends find out that you're fascinated by this stuff, it's what people buy you. You know, they'll buy you this stuff, keep feeding you this stuff. And again in these books, you know, it was all the brave British Tommy up against the German soldier. Is all Achtung and all this kind of stuff, and the Japanese soldier always had the little pair of glasses underneath, like bayoneting the civilians. And all of this kind of really sort of like sunk into me. When I was at school, for some reason, don't know why, the teachers used to let me go out of lessons into the library, and I would spend the whole time reading military history, whether it was Romans, Germans, whatever it was. You know, I was just fascinated by this stuff. And maybe this kind of childhood obsession with all this would have kind of petered out. But when I was 13, I joined an organisation called the Army Cadet Force. Picture up here, I was probably one of those little small ones at the front there, with a jacket too big. I joined the Army Cadet Force, which is a militarised youth organisation paid for by the Ministry of Defence, but it's not a recruitment organisation. Okay? When you join the Army Cadets, you get a uniform, you get taught how to march, you get taught how to strip and assemble a rifle, you get to fire the rifle, and then twice a year you get to go away on these really exciting camps into a real army base where you're taught by real soldiers, and it's all really exciting. Now for myself and other lads of my age at the time, this was something completely different from school, which was focused on the academic, focused on what you could write down and what you could remember. This is about proving yourself physically, which is actually something that's kind of rare in modern society if we think about it, especially the jobs that people can go into. So the Army Cadet Force started to take over my life. When I was been in there for about a year, I got promoted, and then you're allowed to start bossing other kids around. You know, that's pretty sort of exciting for a 13, 14-year-old. Also in the Army Cadet Force, compared to other youth organisations, we were allowed to smoke openly, we were allowed to swear, on the odd occasion we were allowed to drink. So the kind of approach of the Army Cadet Force is almost one of treating the young person, impressionable person, like an adult, and giving them freedoms, some freedoms, that they wouldn't get in other organisations. Anyway, despite the Army Cadet Force not being a recruitment organisation, most of us who lasted through until we got to the age of 16, 17, 18 went on to join the military. I'm going to come on to that in a little bit. But what's happening now? Well, Veterans for Peace, alongside other organisations, we've been working on trying to raise the recruitment age in this country from 16 to 18. We're one of the only countries in the world, one of 19, that still recruits 16-year-olds. And that's what Armed Forces Day is all about. We're all being subjected to a huge amount of one-sided, militaristic propaganda. We'll see red arrows flying through the sky, army parachutists, there'll be tanks in parks for kids to play on, soldiers in their smart uniforms, but it's all very one-sided and it's kind of sugar-coated, and it's not informing our young people and their parents about the true nature of military service. Now, the MOD have kept on coming up with a line this week. We only recruit 16-year-olds into the military with their parents' consent. But if you look at the Armed Forces recruitment videos, and you look at their brochures, they're all quite glamorous. Yeah, you might have people on vehicles. There's one of the guys on quad bikes going through the sort of surf, you know, on the edge of the beach, or you know, people doing press-ups in the mud and all these things. But there's no actual presentation of the possible negative outcomes of military service. Now, Child Soldiers International and Forces Watch have looked into the casualty rates for British soldiers in Afghanistan in this most recent conflict, and it turned out, quite shockingly, that if you joined the British Army at the age of 16, completed your training and deployed to Afghanistan, you were twice as likely to be killed as someone who joined over the age of 18. Now you might be thinking, well, how is that possible? Well, I'll tell you how it's possible. It's because it's British Army policy to funnel the youngest recruits into the most dangerous roles. If you join on your 16th birthday, there's only one branch of the British Army you can go into, the combat arms, the infantry, the cavalry and the Royal Artillery. An infantryman deployed to Afghanistan was 7 times more likely to be killed than any other branch of service. And these are shocking statistics that the MOD is unable to counter. So why are kids joining today? Well, they are being subjected to an immense amount of sophisticated propaganda. The comic books of my youth have become the Call of Duty computer games of today. I often go into schools and one of the first questions I ask, well, the first question I ask is who's in the Army Cadet Force? You usually get a couple of people put their hands up. Who's played Call of Duty? Everybody. Everybody's being indoctrinated into this stuff. The military are being given huge amounts of access into schools. Now, the military would say, we only go into schools when we're invited. But also, they've just produced a learning pack, some of you might have seen on the website, it's on a few websites now, that they have sent out to every head teacher in the country, giving learning resources to teachers, and also explaining how they can have a military community engagement team come into their school. So, this is what's happening today, but there's another sort of like more depressing side to this, if it can be more depressing, and that is where the military is recruiting from. I live in London. Armed Forces Day today has been completely overshadowed by London Pride. You know, it's very difficult for the military to gain traction in London. But the military don't recruit in London. They recruit in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the west of England. Why is that? These are areas of high unemployment, areas where kids are leaving school with limited opportunities. And so, whereas there isn't actually conscription in the United Kingdom today, we could say that there is a process of economic conscription, where if the opportunities available to you are limited, the option of the military with a relatively good wage compared to your local area is an attractive option. So just to finish this segment about why I joined the Army, I really think that if there was you know, a veteran for peace or another peace activist outside of a recruitment office, and they could stop the family of a 16-year-old going in there on the day they were about to enlist and say to the parents, look, here are the facts. Your son is 16, he's about to join the military. In Afghanistan, he would have been twice as likely to die. Do you think those parents would sign that paperwork? I don't think so. And if they did, you'd have to, I think you'd be on the phone with social services, you know, to take that fact in and still sign your child up for this. Right, so moving on. So once someone's walked through the door, signed on the dotted line, what happens to them? You know, how do we take a civilian child and produce a soldier? So what we're going to talk about now is what happens in army training. Now, when I joined the army, I was so indoctrinated by my family, by television, by the Army Cadet Force, that I went into the recruitment office and hardly asked a single question. So for a job that I was signing up to at the time, you had to sign up for 3 years and 3 months. I didn't even know that I'd have to sign up for 3 years and 3 months. I didn't ask how many holidays I would get. I didn't ask what the pay was. I didn't ask anything. I was already there, completely keen to become a paratrooper. So what happened to us when we joined the military? Well, if you look in these learning resource pack I was talking about earlier, and also Michael Gove's big on this. He's not the education secretary anymore, is he? But he was big on this during his time, and he talks about military ethos, how important it is that we must get a military ethos into our schools. Well, when you listen to the government or the military about what that means, they will say to us, it's about teamwork, discipline, loyalty and respect. But actually, military ethos is something a whole lot darker. And when you join the military, and it doesn't matter which part of the military you join, whether it's a chef in the Navy or the parachute regiment, you are indoctrinated into this military ethos. Maybe not at such an intense sort of level, but you are still indoctrinated into this. So what is this military ethos? Well, there are 3 components to it. The first component is to obey. You will follow orders without question. The second component is to kill. You will kill without thinking. And the third is to create a gang-like loyalty to the institution, where the loyalty to the institution overrides everything else, overrides any moral question, overrides any question of, is this good for me as an individual? I'm going to talk a little bit about how this process of indoctrination happens. Now, I think we've all seen films, and I think we could all guess, you know, what's the first thing that happens to you when you join the army? Well, you get a uniform for a start, which plays into that kind of gang loyalty side of things. But the first thing you're actually taught is drill. I think everyone knows what drill is. You know, everyone stood in a line, pretty much knew it there. And you're given orders, turn to the right, turn to the left, salute, march, halt. And what this process is doing is to disengage the front of your brain. The front of your brain that asks questions, why am I doing this? What is the purpose of this? And it disengages that until you have a squad of young soldiers who don't think, they just do. So when the sergeant or the corporal shouts, you know, turn to the right, the whole squad turns to the right without question immediately. This takes about 5 weeks. And so at the end of this process, these soldiers are open to the idea of receiving orders and following them without question. As the process goes on, in my own experience, things get jumbled up a bit. So the different screws, as we would call them, the corporals, would start to issue contradictory orders. One of them would come into the block and say, you must do this needs to look like this, and set us about to work, you know, on a cleaning task or, you know, some sort of organisational task. And within 20 minutes, another corporal would come in, start screaming and shouting at us, what have you done, what have you done, it's got to be like this. And at first, when you're engaging the front of your brain, this doesn't make sense, this isn't rational, what am I supposed to be doing? What do these people want me to do? After a while, you learn to do as you are told. One corporal comes in, tells you to do this, you do this. Another one comes in and tells you to do this, you drop that and do this. The other guy might come in again and tell you to go back to that. It doesn't matter. Your job is to do as you are told. Don't think, don't question, that is going to get you into trouble. This system is also enforced with brutal punishments. When I was going through training, there was a command that would be shouted called corridor. As soon as any one of the screws shouted corridor, we were to drop what we were doing immediately, repeat the command, corridor, everyone would shout corridor, and we'd all run into the corridor. We'd all stand in a line in the corridor. And then they would shout, assume the position. And we would have to sit against the wall like this, with our arms out like this. And when we first started doing this, we could only do it for about 2 minutes, start to wobble around and fall on the floor. But over a period of time, 6 months, we got so good at this, we could do this for about an hour. And they tried to make it more and more difficult, getting us to pass things along and all this kind of stuff. I remember on one occasion, the corridor was shouted, and I was running to get there, and the screw shouted, Griffin, where the F are you? And I made the mistake of answering. I said, I'm on my way. And as soon as I turned up, I was brutally punished, because they don't want you to even think about why you're late, just to run faster. So these punishments would continue. We would often be shouted, when we were in the position, told chins, and we'd all have to stick our chin out, and one of the screws would go along and punch us all in the chin. Or tongues, and we'd stick our tongue out and the screw would go along and pinch all of our tongues. And this is all about confirming that we would follow orders without question. But also at the same time, it was weeding out people who wouldn't do this. A lot of the punishments we had were group punishments. One person mucks up, everyone gets punished. So what's happening here is the brain is being altered. That thinking part of your brain is being switched off or just paused, and the back of our brain, the bit that just sort of like responds mindlessly to things, that fight or flight mechanism is being engaged. Moving on to killing.